know it's a cliche, and we've all heard it and said it ourselves, that inflation is the cruelest kind of tax, hitting hardest those who can least afford it. I wonder, though, if we really understand that inflation is, in fact, a tax increase, a way government can raise more revenue without raising the rates.
Hey everybody, and welcome to The Why Guide. Today we're going to be talking about inflation. This is the first of a three-part series on inflation. We're going to start with how to understand it, just a basic framework for understanding inflation and where it comes from. So starting off with, how did we get from that Ronald Reagan quote, a time where it was understood that inflation generally came from the government and it was a tax on the poor, to quotes like this from current Treasury Secretary and former Fed Chairman Janet Yellen.
We're very committed to achieving our 2% inflation objective and are well aware that for a number of years we've been running under that, and recognize that there are dangers that would be associated with persistent undershoots of our inflation objective.
That was Fed Chairwoman Janet Yellen in 2017 talking about how inflation wasn't high enough and we needed to raise it up. She's now the Treasury Secretary, and good news, mission accomplished. So first of all, the idea that Janet Yellen or any central planner has the formula and knows exactly how much inflation society needs is astoundingly arrogant, but especially for somebody like Janet Yellen, because if you look at her track record, she has a history of just failing her way into promotions. So how is it that we got to this point where we're letting people tell us that inflation is a good thing and we just don't have enough of it? To answer that question, we need to start with the definition of inflation. So if you look at popular culture today, at the government numbers, or even in the dictionary today, it will define inflation as an increase in prices. But that wasn't always the case. Actually, until 2003, until the 10th edition of Merriam-Webster, it was defined in the first 9 editions as an increase in the supply of money and credit, which can lead to an increase in price levels. Now, those two definitions are not exactly the same, and they might seem like they're just a little bit different, but they are important because defining inflation simply as an increase in prices kind of obfuscates where inflation comes from. So we're going to get into now how those two definitions are different, the money supply versus just an increase in price levels, but how they're related. I think the best place to start to understand where inflation comes from and also the relationship between these two definitions would be this equation. M times V equals P times Q. So let's start with the definition of these terms. So M is just the money supply. Now this isn't just deposits at the bank, or physical cash in circulation. This is actually the money supply, deposits at the bank and bank holdings, plus credit. So credit is part of the money supply because it is spendable money. When you take out a loan for $100,000, the bank doesn't actually necessarily have the $100,000 in the bank. They're extending credit, which grows the overall money supply, but you're able to go out and use that $100,000 and enter the economy and compete for goods with it. So credit increases the money supply. Next we have V. So V is the velocity of money. It really just refers to how much is the same dollar changing hands in the economy in a given year. So it gives you some idea of the savings rate versus how much people are just freely spending their money. So M times V makes up what we call the money side of this equation. Now the other side of the equation is what's called the goods and services side of the equation. So P is pretty self-explanatory. It's just the price level. This is what the consumer price index from the government attempts to measure. And then Q is the quantity of goods. This is just how productive is the economy, how many goods and services are out there for consumption. So goods and services side, you have P times Q. So let's dig into each of these a little bit more. So M, back to the money side, both of the items on the money side, both M and V, have a direct relationship with price. So when money supply or velocity goes up, it generally sends the price level up. But they can counteract each other as well. So again, M is the money supply. You'll have a lot of people who will tell you that inflation is only caused by governments or increase in the money supply. This is not exactly true, especially in America. Now, a quick side note, America has, and I will do a video on this in the near future, but America has the US dollar, which essentially has the reserve currency status. What this means is, so if you're talking about Zimbabwe or Argentina or Venezuela, when one of these other countries prints their own currency and a ton of it, they'll very quickly get 40, 80, 100% inflation because it's a very direct relationship. Now, in America, because the US dollar is the reserve currency, our inflation actually gets exported throughout the entire world. That's because most of the world holds dollars. Almost everybody needs to hold dollars to buy things like oil. And again, that's for reasons that we'll get into in another video. But dollars are held by almost every country in the world. So we do not have as serious and as one-to-one a correlation between M and P as most countries do. So we do have a little bit more leeway, in fact, actually a lot more leeway in how many dollars we can print versus how much it sends prices up. But generally, the more you print, the more prices go up. Now, a lot of people tell you that printing money won't send prices up. So famous useful idiot of the New York Times, Paul Krugman, loves to make this point. He specifically points to 2008. Of course, when we had all this money printing at the beginning of the COVID pandemic, you had Joe Biden saying this.
Yeah, there's nobody suggesting there's unchecked inflation on the way. No serious economist.
Now, these people are also just not being honest with you. So a lot of these people who will say that printing a lot of money doesn't increase prices, a lot of them will point to 2008 when a tremendous amount of money was printed in the United States, but the CPI especially, but the general price level didn't really go up that much. Now, the reason is because of V. So again, V is how much the money is being spent. So in 2008, people didn't have money to spend. They had lost their houses, they had lost their investments. In many cases, they had lost their jobs. So the velocity of money plummeted. So if you have M skyrocketing at the same time that V plummets, you can get generally stable prices. But velocity is plummeting because people don't have money to spend. They need deflation. The average person in 2008 needed cheaper groceries. They needed the price of buying their first home to go down. They needed the price of investing in anything to go down because they just didn't have enough money. So V is individual people either saving or spending money, but that was counteracted by a tremendous rise in M. So prices were not allowed to fall as they probably should have. This is why people like Joe Biden in that clip and Paul Krugman are just not being honest with you when they say that printing money doesn't lead to price increases. They're either just lying to you or they're stupid. In Joe Biden's case, I don't want to make a judgment call there. Side note, this is Paul Krugman. Take a second with this quote. This modern day Nostradamus is the guy telling you that printing money doesn't send prices up. Getting back to the goods and services side of the equation, P doesn't really need that much extrapolation. It's just the general price level. But Q probably does. So Q is the quantity of goods and services again. So over time, generally, economies get more productive. So by itself, that should send prices down. Q has an inverse relationship with P. So the more Q goes up, the more P should come down. This is why, again, in 2020, anybody like Joe Biden or Paul Krugman who is telling you that the price would not go up, whether it's because of the HEROES Act or the CARES Act or this infrastructure package, people who were telling you that all of this response and this stimulus after COVID wouldn't send the price level up, they were just lying to you. And the reason is not only was Q going down, China, where we get most of our products, was shutting down. Domestically, we were shutting down a lot of producers. So while Q was going down, M was skyrocketing. We were printing tons of money. In fact, 40% of all the dollars in existence today have been printed since 2020. That is an incredible number. But so anybody who was telling you Q going down combined with M going up wasn't going to send the price level up was flat out lying to you. And yet that's what we saw. We saw a lot of people saying that these things wouldn't send up prices. And anybody who said that at the time is having to backpedal right now. Now, one thing as a side note I do want to mention right here, and I will do a side video on this after this inflation series is done, just because there's so many people talking about it. You hear a lot of people saying that all this inflation is really just due to corporate greed. Don't buy into that narrative. Not that I don't think corporations are greedy, but even if we want to pretend greed really started in earnest in 2020, the numbers don't add up. If you look at the increase in corporate profits, they do not even begin to account for the increase in prices and the inflation that we're seeing. So when you hear people like Richard Wolff or Senator Elizabeth Warren talking about this, these are people who either don't understand economics or they're just invested in the narrative. No conversation about inflation would be complete without discussing the other side of that coin, the dreaded deflation. Now, most people in our society don't understand deflation. You're taught to fear it. You're taught to fear prices falling. You're taught to fear the goods and services you pay for getting cheaper. And you don't know any better because we haven't seen deflation. We haven't seen a drop in the price level since the 1940s, even though we've become much more productive as a society. Q has gone way up. This is not a natural circumstance. But deflation is not any worse than inflation. They're just two sides of the same coin. A lot of people fear it because they think that deflation caused the Great Depression. That is not true. Deflation was a symptom of the economic policies of World War I and the 1920s. It did come along with the Depression, but you can just as easily have an inflationary depression like we did in the 1970s. But don't take my word for it. The National Bureau of Economic Research even came out with a study that said there is no empirical link between deflation and depression. Again, 1970s, prices skyrocketing, definitely not a good thing. On the other hand, you have the period between 1870 and 1913. 1913 was the founding of the Federal Reserve. But even as the money supply went up by about 1 to 2% per year throughout this period, prices were actually lower in 1913 than they were in 1870 because the quantity of goods skyrocketed, because we became so much more productive as a society. This is when we became an industrial power in the world, and the whole period was deflationary. Again, in fact, in a 7-year period in the 1870s, real wage growth, meaning workers' wages versus the price level of goods, real wage growth was up 20% in a 7-year period. 20% increase in real wage growth actually matches real wage growth from 1913 until today. In a period of deflation, workers, their wages became more valuable in a 7-year period than they have in the last 110 years. This is because inflation is kind of a transfer of wealth from the working class, who have a tough time negotiating pay raises as prices are going up, from the working class to investors, people who already own houses and things like that, stocks. But deflation is the opposite. Your wage goes farther. You don't have to negotiate a pay raise. So deflation is a kind of a transfer of wealth from the investor class, from entrepreneurs and employers, to wage earners. You need both in a society. Deflation is no more evil than inflation. Both of them can be good if they're 1, 2, 3%, if they're steady, if they're predictable. Inflation, deflation. This is the economy breathing. This is the scales being balanced from one class of people to another. Sure, it's great if you have some inflation and the value of your house goes up and the value of all your stocks goes up. But what if you're the guy trying to buy a house? What if you're just trying to buy groceries? You need deflation from time to time. These are two sides of the same coin. And we'll talk about this more in the second video, but you're taught to fear it because the people running the system benefit from one of these and not the other. So don't be fooled by all this fear-mongering about deflation. That about wraps up what I wanted to talk about today on episode 1 of this 3-part series on inflation. I hope you learned something about where inflation comes from and kind of how to think about it. In the next episode, we're going to get into a little bit more of that inflation-deflation talk. Who benefits from all this inflation? Why do they benefit from you not understanding it? And most importantly, why do they benefit from hiding it from you, from making you believe inflation has been lower for decades than it actually has been in reality? We all know at this point that the CPI is kind of rigged. 9% inflation does not reflect anybody's increase in cost of living. But in the third episode, if you're still with me, we'll get into the nuts and bolts of how that is, how you're being lied to, how inflation is being hidden, and we have all the receipts from the government's websites themselves. So I hope you'll join me for those. Thanks for stopping by today. Again, I am the Why Guy, and I appreciate you joining me. And if you want to support the channel, head on over to antitanktops.com and get you a provocative t-shirt, especially if you are a Matt Foley fan as I am. And, like and subscribe to the channel. I would really appreciate it. Most importantly, share it with your friends. We cannot do anything about these problems. We cannot do anything about the lies being told to us and the manipulation if we don't first understand it. So spread the word, have the conversations, because I promise you they will not have these conversations on television. Peace.